Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Please silence your phones. The Jerusalem International Book Forum and the Writers' Festival of Mishkenot Sha'ananim are honored to host this afternoon The Hazards of the Writing Journey, a talk between the winner of the Jerusalem Prize, Joyce Carol Oates, and author Michal Govrin. Joyce Carol Oates has published literary works in a variety of genres, including novels, plays, short stories, and poetry. Oates is a frequent contributor to many magazines and also, I'm told, equally prolific on Twitter. She is the recipient of many prestigious awards. The Jerusalem Prize is the latest of which. A seemingly inexhaustible wellspring of rich imagination. In every book she forges new ground, wrote the jury of the prize. Her latest novel, Hazards of Time Travel, appeared in late 2018. Her next title to appear in Hebrew is The Falls, to be published by Hakibutz HaMeuchad. The translation is now being edited. Michal Govrin is an internationally renowned and award-winning novelist, essayist, poet, and theater director. She has published 11 books thus far and has directed plays in major Israeli theaters. Her forthcoming book, The Passion of Jerusalem, Journey to the Myth, will appear very soon, also in Hakibutz HaMeuchad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Joyce Carol Oates and Michal Govrin.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome Joyce Carol Oates to this stage. I'm very moved and honored to have this conversation with you on the stage and in front of the Jerusalemite audience and the international visitors that came over here. I would like to start this afternoon by evoking the memory of Ze'ev Birger, who was the director of the book fair for many years and gave over the direction now to Yoel Makov. Ze'ev Birger was also behind the Jerusalem Prize for many years, and I doubt if he was not one of those who described it as it is, a prize for a literary oeuvre which is for the freedom of freedom in society. Ze'ev, a survivor of the camps, brought the message from evil into light and literature as a way of living. I'm sure he would have been proud of our decision, and I feel his presence with us tonight very much. Joyce, if I may call you like that in our conversation, you have given us a tremendous body of work, really encompassing worlds. And in that sense, I think that today with us are all the heroes and the plots that you have created, the worlds that buzz around us. So many lives, so many psyches, so many fates that you have described and followed and have given us. Every novel is a journey. Every novel is a hazard. We've called this afternoon meeting the hazards of the writing journey. And here you are on this journey to Jerusalem. So if I may start with this apropos, which is the present moment, can you already put in words the first impressions of or whatever you've come with before coming to Jerusalem? Because as we know, the journey to Jerusalem starts before you arrive here. So what is the novel or the beginning of the novel of your journey to Jerusalem?
Well, can you all hear me? Is this working? Well, it's a very complex question, because as a writer, I've always been characteristically sort of open to new experiences and open to possible mysteries and impressions. So I actually don't try to make any conclusions. I mean, even after I've been in a place for a while, it could be years, I don't really have conclusions. I more have like questions, or I try to have some sense of the spirit of a place and the people who represent the place. In my own writing in the past, I might actually begin with a geographical place, with a literal place, and try to imagine who would be living there, as if the landscape had some sort of spiritual dimension, and it creates the people who live there. In my novels set in Detroit, for instance, I try to imagine that. In my novel Blonde, which is very much a novel of Southern California at a certain period in history, the spirit of that place gives us someone like Norma Jean Baker, who becomes Marilyn Monroe. So she's sort of in that place at that time. So my impressions of Jerusalem are just very inchoate and kind of spinning. And I spent a wonderful morning at the Israeli Museum, which is a fantastically beautiful museum, and so overwhelming in its variety that one could just sort of spend weeks there in the different parts of it. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, but my usual way of writing is not to actually form any decisions or conclusions until I'm really in the midst of writing.
Absolutely.
And then I have mediated characters. The voices of my writing are not my own voice, but the mediated voices of characters. So I have to know what their journey is, and wherever they start out will not be where they end. So they have a little trajectory to go through. They could be misinformed, they could have the wrong idea, they could be deluded or even deranged, and the journey of the novel takes them through some sequence of visions.
Yeah, and last night at the reception of the prize, you've evoked another journey to Jerusalem, which has started maybe in your childhood without you knowing it.
Yes, yes.
And in that sense, I found it extremely moving, because Jerusalem is a secret. It's a secret place. And in a way, you had that secret. You had a secret. And there is now a juxtaposition between a lifelong secret, slowly revealed, with the heritage of your grandmother, and the impact, which is so moving, that you have described that she had on your inner self, on building you.
Yes, yes.
And in a sense, that was maybe an unsaid, unuttered, not spoken in words transmission.
Yes.
Is that part of your arrival to Jerusalem?
Well, it's such an emotional subject. I really get kind of a little bit tearful when I talk about it. So maybe I will kind of glide over it. But my grandmother was, as I said last night, if anyone was there, said that the only person, the only adult in my whole large family, some of whom were Irish and Hungarian, a very different kind of background. But this one person, my grandmother, was the only one who read books, and she gave me a book. At every opportunity, she gave me a book. And she paid for music lessons, piano lessons, and she did other things like that. So as it turns out, decades later, I discovered that this grandmother was Jewish. And I'm not saying, what can I say? It's all the whole Jewish respect for culture and tradition and books and writing was all there. It was all there when I was tiny, but I didn't know it. So I don't want to get emotional about it. So she never acknowledged that she was Jewish, and her whole life was a mystery. She was a wonderful grandmother. She was filled with love, but she defined herself exclusively in the family as the purveyor of love, and there was never any sense that she had misfortune or melancholy in her life or loneliness, which she must have had. So it was a sort of a model, maybe the kind of model of femininity that we in our generation have to fight against, where the woman is all service to the family and love, but her own life is a mystery because she never followed that life. So all these things are sort of issues with us. But when we look back on our own families, it's the people who bring us love and support and emotional support, which is so important to a writer, to have some sympathy. Not to have people who are doubting you or want to censor you or who inhibit or suffocate you, but people who just give you that little bit of emotional uplift that may carry you through your whole life.
Yeah, and I think that in a way, in your novels, the character starts with an urge. And in that sense, maybe, if I can imagine from your words, your grandmother, who on the surface was that person, you had that special contact and transmission, and there are so many characters in your writing of teenagers who look for their lives,
Yes.
search, and that moment is so well described. The struggle to know who I am,
Yes.
and someone might give you a hand at
Yes.
that moment
Yes.
and maybe help you, but then there is an inner urge. So in that sense, I think that knowing, as a reader, knowing that fact, I could understand where it comes from, and in a way also maybe see your grandmother in a deeper, not only the surface, but what has been through this transmission, which is so well described in so many of your works.
Yes, and I think some of these purveyors of love and sympathy themselves have come from very difficult backgrounds. It's as if they just said, well, I'm not going to give in, I'm not going to be broken, I'm not going to be depressed, I'm going to just sort of move on into the future. So I try to have that attitude myself, rather than looking back. We have a kind of quasi-culture in the United States in recent decades of people really sort of bearing their souls and being victims and sort of blaming other people in a largely confessional way, looking back on their families and blaming people if their lives are not perfect, instead of seeing that they may be responsible, sort of blaming other people. And I think that my grandmother and also my own parents never tried to blame or even make excuses for themselves, and they had no self-pity. It was just completely nothing that ever came up at all. It was more like looking forward to the next day and working hard and just sort of having a positive attitude. So I do believe in reinvention of the self. You can be broken, you can be actually broken, but you sort of pick yourself up and just, go forward. So it's a little different from the Freudian model where you're looking back all the time, trying to see like what was wrong and whether the faults were, finding some little difficulties and problems in the domestic triangle, whatever it was. But rather than taking that attitude that everything's determined in the past, to sort of look into the future.
I can go on that and saying that might be a Jewish attitude also, in the fact that there are so many catastrophes, and from one catastrophe to the other, you just have to go on and choose life. Absolutely. So there is something very deep in that. But I think in that sense there is something similar between the American ethos, especially at the pioneers, and the Israeli Jewish ethos. And in that sense, I feel that in your body of work, with all the genres in which you speak with the history of literature, of world literature, but very much also of the American literature, with a variety of characters, you have somehow encompassed at least a large canvas of what might be a basis for an American myth, of what is America in that sense, by seeing also the characters, the evil and the good, the passionate, the wicked, from all classes, and in that sense, would you look back? I'm sure that wasn't your aim, a conscious aim, but looking up at that a wonderful array of books and saying that you have made a map, like Faulkner in a way, not of a region, but maybe of what America is in a certain epoch at least.
Yes, I think that's very well put. I would definitely agree with that. The novels are, some of them are actual epics. They sort of like American epics, and other works of fiction are short and even lyric poetry. And I think see the typical American vision as seeking an identity that's not necessarily already given, you know, and moving from an old world. In many cases, it was England or Northern Europe, moving from that old world to a completely new world, and trying not to bring too much of the old world along with you. I'm very sympathetic with the 19th century American transcendentalists, and Henry David Thoreau is one of the writers whom I read when I was quite young. And I really, every page of Henry David Thoreau's Walden and some of his other essays and his journals is just imbued with such a sense of poetry and dignity, but also a kind of, and I mean this positively, a very adolescent kind of skepticism and sense of humor and almost disrespect and irreverence that you'll find in Thoreau for organized religion and institutions and just the older establishment. Henry David Thoreau is famous for saying, "I have never received one syllable of good or even useful advice from anyone over the age of 30. And he had this youthful adolescent attitude more or less all of his life. Now, he didn't live to be very old, which is another consequence of having been in that time, you know. People tend to die fairly young. But his mentor was Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson is a beautiful writer. He has beautiful poetry. Emerson is extremely abstract, and Thoreau is extremely specific. So even though they're both akin temperamentally, they're very different writing experiences. So when you read Emerson, you're reading poetry and very abstract philosophy. But Thoreau, he'll tell you how to build a cabin and how to fish and how to make a boat. But in the middle of all that, he's also presenting a way of life that he would say is not burdened by the past. He's not going to be burdened by the literature of England, the way most people who came to the United States were sort of bringing the English tradition, bringing English politics, English history, and English literature with them, which could be, you know, the burden of Shakespeare and the burden of Milton. There's extraordinary great bodies of literature, but quite a burden on the backs of people who wanted to be writers and who were trying to be writing, you know, in their own way. So I got a little bit off the subject, but I think that the vision of America has always been this attempt to re-envision, to reinvent oneself. Now, I'm more maybe emotionally sympathetic with the vision of Canada. If you're looking at North America, Canada and the United States have sort of contrasting ideologies. You probably know that. And I don't want to get into the details of it, but in America, there's this maybe too much respect for the rugged individual who has to have his own guns, and the whole mystique of having your own guns and carrying your machine guns with you, you know, and sort of associated with masculinity and manhood, and it's become extremely neurotic and exaggerated in America. In Canada, there's respect for what they call the common weal, the community, and America sort of focuses on the rugged individual. All that, I think, has beginning in the 19th century. And the Canadian expansion of the West, when the Canadians, pioneers went west, they met the Mounties already there. In other words, there was law and order established. Whereas when the Americans went west, there was nothing there. There was lawlessness. So, and you needed your guns, and you needed to be a bully or have a bully on your side. Whereas Canada was more like the respect for law and order and civilization. So between the two, I think as time goes on, many people find the Canadian vision of the commonweal a little more attractive than the vision of the rugged individual. I hope none of this is getting back to the United States. A lot of people were carrying their guns, you know. They get very, very abusive on Twitter. You think they're trying to take their guns away from them. The idea is to have gun control, like sensible gun control is not taking everybody's guns away from them. Though, in fact, that would not be a bad idea.
Yeah, I think that in that sense, I mean, your ability to portray the person who carries a gun,
Yes.
and to go on into the psyche, and even in that
Yes.
sense to understand it is remarkable. That it's, I mean, there isn't beforehand the judgment. They are also characters in that sense.
Yes.
You go into the
Yes.
guts of what the brutality of the American reality is. In that sense, I think that more than urban, I mean, raised writers, maybe your background of knowing these people
Yes. Yes.
helps you to go and understand these characters and their passions and what they need and why do they do that without judging them.
Yes, it's very surprising when I say I'm from a gun culture. I grew up in the gun culture, and so I do understand some of the psychology behind it. But much of it is brainwashing now in the United States, where I think men, not exclusively men, but maybe mostly men, are told that it's somehow associated with being masculine. You know, so they're really being brainwashed to believe that, so that they buy the guns. It's sort of, I think, a consumer capitalist situation where the manufacture and the selling of the guns and the bullets is the main ideology, but that's hidden, you know, because there's kind of surface ideology to make people buy things, which is typical of an advertising culture. You make people feel uneasy with images suggesting that they're incomplete, and then because of that, they will go out and pay some money for some merchandise or some trinket that you don't even need or might be sort of negative in your life.
Yeah, I mean, life. I mean, life is beautiful. Coca-Cola, in that
Like
sense.
that sort of thing,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yes.
But also in your writing, I think of for The Beasts, for example, and other novels, art is a mode of going through and acquiring identity,
Yes.
and very much also connected in a surprising and very powerful way to the instincts and to eros,
Yes.
and how these urges in adolescent, in young adulthood, as a young persons, how that can drive a person through life or through the common commodities to be sold. I mean, against the veneer of things, something like touching. I would say maybe the sense of what life is in maybe in Thoreau's way, even in the metaphysical way.
Yes, that's very well put, and actually almost no one's ever pointed that out in my writing. And almost all my novels, there is that the lifeline is the creative force.
Absolutely.
Sylvia Plath said that poetry is the juggler. The juggler vein is poetry, you know, and that's so true, like the life pulsing the vein, especially for women who have maybe traditionally not been allowed to express themselves creatively, inhibited and censored and made to feel that it's not womanly or that you have to do things within the household. So for a woman to be really liberated to realize this creative juggler vein, I think is very thrilling. I have also written about men and like young men and boys who have this creative lifeline also. But somehow it seems to be associated mostly in my writing with the female. And it can be violently disruptive of a domestic life and sort of eviscerate a relationship, but ultimately it's positive. And I think of art on the whole, I don't know whether everybody would agree, but I think of art as always bringing something to the world, but not displacing anything. That art is an offering to the world. People may say, I don't want it, or they don't like it, but it doesn't displace or render anything else in any negative way. It's an offering that you offer. You write your novel and you offer it, your poetry. If people don't like it, that's all right. But that is like a graceful, something that's filled with grace. It's a positive thing. And so it doesn't hurt anybody. It's not like the rugged individualism of the gun culture, which is always a threat or an actual act of aggression.
Yeah, but words have power as well.
They have a power,
and
but they can be countered by other words that they don't really annihilate. usually.
I mean, but the words can kill as well. I mean, words can brainwash. Words can be dangerous. I mean, there is also the responsibility of words, and where does it go? Uh, but to go back to words, literature, and the power of life, the vein, the pulse of life, and eros, I think that is very something that I really found extremely powerful in your writing, is the necessity to give an expression, either by life, by running to a lover, or by reading poetry, to give an expression, a free expression. If we speak about freedom in society, that's also a form of freedom in society.
Yes, and I think the visual arts are particularly wonderful in that people who may not be all that articulate and they don't have experience with the linear, writing, but the visual self, which really arises in our dreams. We have dreams every night that are all very visual and very hallucinatory and can be very wonderful. That I think is, I wouldn't say always, but almost always doesn't bring any harm to the world. You look at the paintings of Van Gogh or Gauguin, Monet, the beauty is so transcendental, it's almost impersonal. Like you don't think a particular person actually painted these wonderful watercolors, the water lilies of Monet, for instance. And then looking at the Australian Aboriginal art, which probably some of you have seen and reproduced, I've actually, if you've been in Australia, you've probably seen these enormous canvases that are so mystical and they're sort of geometrical. They don't have any figure, any objective outlines of bodies or trees or landscapes at all. They seem to come from someplace really deep inside the soul, and they're just haunting and enthralling. And that seems to me like images of pure spiritual or emotional beauty without being rendered in terms of any objects. And that seems to be a very high form of beauty that the Aboriginal artists, many of them older women, quite elderly women, that they have sort of bypassed all sorts of stages of an individual life to get to this rendering of a transcendental art that just speaks to so many people who know nothing about them and have no idea of their history.
Also the fact that it's not for the sake of beauty, but that the canvases, these big canvases, contain the process in them, time. I mean, I was amazed to see that there are layers on layers. Some of them we don't see. There are seasons. Sometimes it rained, so the painting was like that. Then spring came, and they painted over the rain with spring. And then summer came, and then again they painted over. So in a way, you see a diary which is hidden, but you feel that art and life, in a way, emerge in the most existential, religious for them also, like the sand drawings where they dance through. But it is like a routine, like a Jew getting up in the morning and putting on his tefillin and starting the ritual, because life is a ritual. So in a way, art is a ritual, which brings me, if I may ask, maybe you can share with us the secret of your routine of writing. Oh. How do you start? From where do you start? Is it an idea, a character, a place, an emotion? And then how do you manage?
Well, I'd be happy to answer that, but we go from the sublime to the banal.
But you just saw that the sublime and the mundane are very connected to each other.
But just to go back to what, is it Michal?
Michal.
That's, we can't really say that too well. Anyway, it's a beautiful name. So
it's from the Bible. She was the wife
Michal.
of David. Michal.
I've been practicing the Hebrew, but it's clearly
we will continue afterwards.
Anyway, about these large canvases, that the weirdness about it is somebody who collects the art in New York City, who's a friend of mine. He said the weird thing about it is what looks to us like geometrical and purely spiritual, to them was very specific. And so I'm standing there trying to see, this is something that they did 5 weeks ago or 40 years ago, and then this is something else. But somehow when we see it, we don't see any of that. Now, we may feel some of that in a kind of subliminal way, but the more you know about it, the more bewildering it is. Usually, the more you know about a work of art, the more you know about it. In this case, the more you know about, the more confused you are and sort of totally mystified by how they get to where they are from where they say they're coming from, and obviously they're telling the truth. But that's just to to mention that. This is very, very specific and very individual. So they're like diaries or journals, but we don't really see that. Oh, my own routine always begins with running or walking. I need to run a lot, and I do run as much as I can back home. I haven't been running here. I've been walking. Sometimes if I can't really run, I just walk around in some space and just walk and walk and walk and think, because I think when we're in motion, our imaginations are sort of given a sort of aerated. And I like to run on a country road back home, right near my own house in Princeton, New Jersey. There's some areas like I run up a hill, and I say at the top of that hill, there will be awaiting some revelation or some little epiphany, some idea. I've had so many have been waiting up there. But if I sit at my desk with a laptop, it's very stagnant and static, and it's just the inertia. I have a friend named Grill Marcus. Have you heard of him? This wonderful cultural critic. He's written a lot about Bob Dylan. So when I was at Berkeley, and I just got back from Berkeley really just last week, Grill Marcus and his wife and I would go walking along the small mountain every morning. They would come by my house around 8 o'clock. We'd walk a little mountain and walk up this hill, then come down again. And Grill Marcus, who's, as I said, has written about Bob Dylan and Johnny Rotten and other people like that. He said that for 35 years he's been walking up the same walk. And he said, it's right over here I got the idea for my book, Lipstick Traces, which is sort of a famous book. Over there I got the idea for my book, The Old Weird America. He said, I can remember walking up the hill and the idea was sort of waiting for me. And there is that, there really is that in running and walking. I'm sure there are people in the audience who run like that. Or maybe some people swim, and you're sort of getting these visions which would not be available if you just stayed sitting in one place.
Yeah, I have a husband, a mathematician. He swims to have his equations.
Ah, yes, yes. If you take that away, then there is really a handicap.
Yeah. Running, I'll turn to some of the kitchen, the cuisine of writing. I mean, there's so much running in your writing. And there is also running in the form, in the genres that you choose. I was very interested in the fact that sometimes the plot is, and the suspense, which might be for you, maybe is the secret of what a novel is, of what storytelling is. The suspense is so well taken by the fact that the events are somehow announced, and then you come back to what happened before.
Mm-hmm.
And the announcement, like maybe that point on the hill which awaits for us, creates already a tension, unbearable tension to get there again. And then, but you have to go through and the unfolding of the story. So this technique of is that the way the consciousness is projected into style, because sometimes the novel is kind of neuroscience, in that science that the novel is a way that you project out through words the way our brain works? Or is that a need to run, as many of your characters run, of fear, of shame, of so many things, and the running somehow is the plot, or is the beginning of a plot?
Well, because we're writers rather than performers, we're basically working with a lot of time. And so we have the time to tell a story, we have the time to absorb the story, and we have the time to interpret the story. So when you begin your novel, and when I begin my novel, when the reader begins it, we're at the end. You know, we've already see the end. And so when the reader begins and we begin telling the story, it's suffused already with a sense of finality and coherence. And that sense of coherence is what makes it so different from a diary, which is just sort of a plunge into the unknown. If you keep a diary honestly and never change anything, it's quite it's a story of a journey and maybe a struggle. But there's usually no meaning in the daily entries in a diary, because that's not part of life in your immediacy. We don't have the distance to be interpreting what we're doing immediately. But when you're writing a work of fiction, everything is dependent on that structure. So I could begin a novel that would be on page 400 of a linear transcription of the same novel. I often do that. So there's the linear, say the chronological transcription of a novel that could be like 1,000 pages long. It starts here and it ends here. But when you want to present it, you don't want to start at the beginning. You start at some climatic point, like right here, and then you can have some flashbacks. This is the great tradition of Homer. You begin in medias res. You're beginning with the action at a crucial point, and then when it's necessary, you have flashbacks, but they're selected. You're not going to put all the thousands of pages in there.
Yeah. And how do you choose the genre? Because you have used so many genres in order to write. I can provide my answer as a reader, but I would like to. And I think that their choice is for me as a reader is the best one, because in a way it embodies the subject matter. But how do you do that?
In a way, it's a somewhat mysterious effort. Say you have a voice in your head. That voice could be a lyric poem, or it could be a monologue. It could be something that is a voice, and that's not really your own voice, but just it interests you and has a certain musicality, and you want to give expression to it. So that could actually be a little poem. It could then be a monologue, but if it's a monologue, it could be part of a series of monologues, or it could be in a play, and it like a soliloquy in a play. It's basically how much time you want to spend on it. If a strange voice comes to you that's exciting to you, you could put it in a poem, but then if it haunts you, you might think, well, this is part of a longer story. You try to imagine who that person is and where he's coming from. However, you can begin the other way around. As I said, there is a spirit of place, and I think some landscapes have kind of spiritual dimension. And we say some landscapes are haunted. So they're haunted by who? By who was there. So you're beginning actually with a place or a historical event, and then you try to imagine who is there. So in a way, that's the opposite of starting with the voice. So all these ways, I think, are equally fruitful. Now, they also frustrating and challenging. The longer the novel, I think the more frustration.
In what sense?
Well, the more work you have to do.
Oh, yeah,
It's
that's
like
for sure.
It's like tilling a large garden rather than just some little pot. You know, you have a little lyric poem. I like to work on lyric poems, and I have little poems that are that long. I mean, some of Emily Dickinson's greatest poems are this long, and they're beautiful. But Emily Dickinson never attempted to write a long narrative. She never wrote an epic poem. She didn't have that kind of imagination, evidently. If she did, she would probably have tried to do that. Flannery O'Connor is a quintessential short story writer. When she tries to write a novel, it's sort of a short novel, which is like a long story then. She didn't really have, I think, the imagination to write a novel. Some people can write novels and they don't write short stories. I think maybe Toni Morrison perhaps has not written a short story. She thinks in terms of novels because it's like being a long distance marathon runner instead of a sprinter. Some people just have different imaginations. And rather than try to make yourself do something that you can't really do, it's better to cultivate something that you do very well. I tell my students that. Don't try to build up your weaknesses, just forget about them. Look at your strengths. Just work with your strengths. If you write short stories, first-person confessional stories, stay with that. That's good.
If you speak about the students, I thought about asking you, quoting Rilke in the letter for the young poet, what would you say to a young writer today in our worlds where literature is, where reading is, in the state of the world and what we have lived for the last in the last century, what would be your advice for a young writer?
Well, since I'm teaching almost constantly, I must be giving advice to young writers all the time. Well, my young writers at Berkeley, I'm just sort of reading their portfolios now. They embarked upon quite a journey. It was really exciting, and some of them had never taken a writing course before, though all of them are good writers. To get into the workshop, they had to submit some writing, but some of them actually never taken a workshop before. So we had a text, an Oxford Book of American Short Stories, and each week I would assign a classic older story, like by Jack London, and then a contemporary by somebody living at the present time, like Tobias Wolff. Or it could be Faulkner and Ray Carver, or Hemingway and Amy Hempel, kind of a nice combination. So in each case, there's a thematic similarity between the classical older writer and the contemporary. The theme is almost always pretty similar, but the presentation is totally different. Jack London is totally different from Tobias Wolff. Hemingway is very different from almost everybody else that precedes him. But people who follow Hemingway, many of them are echoing Hemingway. And I would teach maybe a story like The Lottery by Shirley Jackson.
Yeah,
And the students just react to that enormously. So the next week, their assignment would be to write a story in the mode of Shirley Jackson, which is not a satire or a plagiarism. And they come up with amazing things. So some of the students are neurobiology. Students are in environmental ecology. They're not necessarily in English, but they're brilliant students at Berkeley. And so each week they would bring something in that was really exciting. Then we had the most fun with Edgar Allan Poe, because the Telltale Heart, which is a crazed, mediated voice, like a madman's voice. They really, really like that a lot. And then there's a young contemporary writer, he's only 35 years old, named Anthony Marra, M-A-R-R-A. Some of you may have heard of him. So he rewrote the Telltale Heart, setting it in a social media situation. And so they read the two stories together, one from the 19th century, the mid-19th century, and the other from 2019, and saw how the two themes were together. So those are sort of things that I don't necessarily tell my students. I sort of evoke them to do these exercises. And then they put together their portfolios, and I said, well, you have to have an actual book. I want to see a cover. I want to see art on the cover and your name. And then on the back, I want to see a little biographical note of you. And I want to see quotes from your mother, your roommate, or me. In other words, I want you to write your first book. And it doesn't have to be in 3 dimensions. That's online. So they've been sending to me these works today, and like in yesterday. And the visual, the art they choose, some of them did their own art, some of them choose it from online sources. The art that they choose brings us a totally other dimension to what they're writing. And it's very thrilling to see how they made so much out of one semester. Some of them are have really created work they can be very proud of. So that's the sort of thing I would say to a young writer, to actually go and do it.
Yeah, that's the best advice, and be himself or herself in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming to where I began the conversation with Zeev Birger, and I also was very close, and I feel he's listening to us, Aaron Appelfeld, that I know that you know his work. And coming back maybe to that journey that you did between America and Jerusalem, and the two realities, and how literature is embedded in language, in tradition, in heritage, and in history. And you are obsessed with history as well, and with big events that cross the life of individuals, and bring to it your voice, your singular voice, and your female voice as a writer, entering to what was supposed to be a solely male place of speaking about the big history. in that sense, writing from Jerusalem or writing from Israel as a writer, which you might imagine, is a load of history and is a load of a reality and of a heritage and of a language, which in one way we saw how Zionism and the history of America is close to each other. On the other hand, it's so different in the sense that we carry such a long heritage and such a load on us. So in that sense, I would point not to the big questions, but I'll go back to your characters to frame my question in a way that won't become a long, general conversation. Many of your characters are singled out. They are different. They are different from the rest. And they carry it like a wound. They carry it in the beginning like something which is a burden. They don't look like the others. They have maybe qualities, or they have misfortunes, or they have, but they are different. And the segregation, which comes in your novel on many, many levels, both from the beautiful young man to the girl who is the gravedigger daughter, to whatever character who is different from the others. Is that a point where literature can contribute? And ask it, and in the back of my mind is always the identity of a Jew as being different from himself, herself, of being immensely beforehand, as Sartre said, different in the eyes of the other. So the balance between the way that people see you as different and the way maybe you struggle to become different in your own terms, or?
Probably literature and art do single out characters who are a little larger than life. And we might choose to write about people who are representative of something beyond themselves. So they may be by very nature of heroic stature, or more reckless, or more self-destructive. It's like the characters in Shakespeare we remember are a little larger than life. So writers and artists are drawn to those personalities. It may be that this is the inherent romanticism of art, that you say, I am a very special person and I'm an exceptional person because I inhabit this being. It's possibly a romantic predilection.
But maybe also a definition of the human being.
And also each individual is different.
Yeah.
Some people, however, try to take refuge in conformity, and they really want to submit themselves to a ritual. They don't necessarily want to stand up and be counted singly. But one of the characteristics that some nations have, certainly Israel and the United States, is a sense of exceptionalism, of being very special. And I don't think that Canada's burdened with that same sense. I mean, if you look upon it philosophically and not emotionally, what does it mean to have an exceptional destiny? I mean, think about it for a minute. Is it a blessing, or is it something else? I mean, some people are so yearning to be completely self-determined, and they need to be able to swim with their heads above the water, So if they're burdened with the past and a real reverence and maybe being hypnotized by the past, they're maybe not going to make it. So I also have a sense of the people who are willful, and I mentioned Henry David Thoreau, who are kind of mutinous and willful, and they march to a different drummer. I think Thoreau may have coined that phrase. If I don't do what you think what you're doing, it might be that I march to a different drummer. So I'm interested in those people too, and they don't feel that they're part of a nation. They don't feel they're part of a religion or institution. And when Henry David Thoreau graduated from Harvard, he didn't bother to pick up his diploma. In those days, they were actually on sheepskin. And he said, let every sheep keep his own skin. So I think he never actually, maybe never actually even graduated. He sort of did all the work, and he probably got very high grades, but then when it came to getting the degree, which is everybody else was doing, he didn't bother doing that. So I kind of feel a real sympathy and admiration for that, that individual. Now, what does this say about a nation or a tribe or even a family? Well, it's obviously a mutinous gesture. So somebody who does that, who doesn't march, he marches to his own drum, or he's not marching to a military beat. What do you do if you have an army? What do you do with a person like that? These are questions that a novelist might take up because they're really kind of, dramatic, and Shakespeare would write about something like that. What do you do with the defiant individual who is really sees himself as exceptional if you have a nation state and so forth? Those are issues that novels can take up because they're big. There's a lot of space in a novel.
Changing of names is also part of your writing.
Yes,
I mean, the characters who change their names, and I think about another great, from a great Israeli writer, Aaron Appelfeld, whose name was changed against his will when he arrived to Israel. He didn't have, the library of his parents was smashed. He didn't have a language, and for him to acquire the Hebrew and to start reading the Bible and copying the Bible was really building himself. And in a similar way, I think that he wrote also something like more than 40 novels. He brings back people, many people, and brings back and bridges the European world to us with so many characters, and bridges in that way another way of defining the place, just to say that one writer from the other can offer a totally different image of what the world is. And I think that in your extraordinary work, Joyce, you have offered us a myriad of angles of entering to what a woman's soul and life is, what is being singled out from your background. And we could start again and ask about your upbringing and how did you persevere and what were the wounds that you did have on way in order to be singled out and be excellent and like one of the swimmers in your books. And in that way it's a very precious and dear to heart, a gift of so many voices, so many characters. So I would ask you to give us the concluding word, if you want, of this conversation.
Are you suggesting something about origins? Yeah.
Yes, I was amazed to read about your origins and to see the path that you have done, and the will to emerge from a place and take it with you without repudiating it. So that, I think, is a gesture that, in a sense, was a breaking through, and at the same time embracing it and being enriched by it. And it's a very complex one, and maybe one of a woman that can encompass so much, can contain.
Well, when you look at your life at the present moment, it's, if you've lived a while, it's sort of like a tree that has many branches, and then some of the branches are very thin and sort of going up. But if you trace back to your origins, it's like a trunk of a tree. It's much more simple. So though it's hard to talk about one's influences when one is older, when you look back, there are sort of roads that you took. You went this way, but you didn't go that way, like turning points in lives. I'm very interested in that, because the most profound book that I was given in my whole life, I guess, was when I was 9 years old, because it was the first book. So I was given by my wonderful Jewish grandmother. She gave me Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. So this is a classic. It's a classic of children's literature, but also of adult literature. So right away, that was just fantastic good luck. She gave me a very, very potent, mythic book that I can read today and learn from, as well as when I was 9 years old. So I like to think that she chose that book carefully, and that it was indeed the one book that would liberate me. So I was reading a children's book about a little girl who was about 10 years old. I was like 9. she's like 10 or 11. If you remember, Alice is a very mature child. She's faced with terrifying nightmares and hallucinatory, horrible things. Really, really, really adults behaving very, very insanely, murderously. She's facing a world of cannibalism. There's a lot of eating going on in both the Alice books. You may not remember that, but children are terrified of being eaten, evidently. We've forgotten these anxieties. But children's literature and fairy tales are filled with that terror of being eaten. But Alice doesn't become terrified. And that's amazing, because when you read the book and it's mediated through her consciousness, things that would drive a child into a screaming terror don't phase Alice. She gets a little bit annoyed. She stamps her foot. She says, oh, she's behaving. The Red Queen is behaving very badly. But Alice is likely to just sort of pull herself up, and lift her chin and deal with adults behaving like mad people and deal with it very sanely. So for a little girl to read that and see that another little girl's behaving very maturely, that's something that you're assimilating without having any idea that it's very important. Then another fact of the Alice books is they're wildly hallucinatory. It's like Lewis Carroll had LSD. So every page is filled with these most images of the expanding consciousness, and somebody shrinking and getting very big, and the neck getting very long, and all this physicality of a child and adolescence being afraid of your own body. All that is dramatized there. So you're reading about it, but it's within this coherence. There are chapters, and the chapters add up to a book, and the book has an ending. And at the ending, Alice wakes up from a dream. And there are never any adults. You never see her family, so she did it on her own. That in itself is something that you're absorbing as a little girl. Alice did the journey on her own. All she has at the end is there's a kitten. There's a little kitten that she's holding, but no parents. She did it by herself. So my grandmother gave me that book. Now, if I go back in time, what if she had not given me a book? What if my grandmother had not existed? Or she was a completely different person, or everything was different, or she was ill, or something, so that I didn't get that book. I think I'd be a different person today. I think that giving me that book when I was 9 years old, when I trace it back, I have to be honest, I think it really changed my whole life. And that's actually almost just what we call fortune, good fortune.
And are you going to write the Joyce Carol Oates novel, The Life of Your Autobiography?
Well,
Are we to expect that thrilling book?
I often write about the roads not taken, because that interests me more, because obviously we're inhabiting. But every one of us has had turning points, and yet in our minds, the other conscious is still there. I don't know where you went to university. Where'd you go to university?
I grew up in Tel Aviv, and I went to the university in Tel Aviv, and then I went to Paris and lived in a chambre de bonne.
You see, you
on
went
the
to
Rue de Rivoli.
Paris.
Yes, I went to Paris.
That was your big.
That was
That
my
was
leap.
the big leap. Yeah.
And from there, I came back in a
And
deeper
then you
way.
came back,
In
right?
a deeper way.
But
Yes.
see, that's like the story of your life. That is a big, big leap, and then you came back and so forth. So, we all have leaps like that, but there could have been a self of you that didn't go to Paris,
Absolutely.
very
and then-
easily.
And the breaking and the breaking and the break is crucial. And the breaking, since childhood, we can all trace those moments where we chose something and not the other way.
And chose something maybe risky.
Absolutely. More risky is more
Much
exciting,
more risky.
as we know.
Yes, well, I think to do that, you have to be courageous, but maybe get a little support from a family, though you may have to sometimes reject your family to make that break and then come back. I think that's
But maybe the Jewish grandmother, or for my sake, I didn't know my grandparents, the Jewish mother and father somehow told you that you can do that.
you can do it. Yes, you flex your wings. That's
Yes.
right. But it
So-
is very risky, and many people just don't do it. They stay right close to home. I come from a world where most people continued to live their whole lives within about 7 miles of where they were born. And my mother was, I mean, she never went anywhere. She would probably have said she was very happy and she had no complaints, but the fact is, it's an economic situation, sort of also, like the class of, many people in the past didn't have the wherewithal. They didn't have any money to travel.
So these are the hazards of the journey of writing.
Yes, as well
And,
put. Yes.
So in that note, I really thank you,
Thank
and
you.
absolutely from the bottom of my heart.